Well, welcome back to the Azure Podcast. This is episode number 502, being recorded on the 14th of August, 2024, with special guest Audrey Long. I'm Sujit, and on Teams with me, we have Cynthia and Kendall. Good to see her back again. And of course, our special guest Audrey, who we'll get to in just a minute. But before that, let's cover some updates in the Azure space from this past week, the past couple of weeks since we did the last episode. So I'm going to cover a few of them, and of course, everyone feel free to jump in with comments if anything sounds of interest to you. API management, the API management WordPress plugin has been now released. It's in public preview, and this allows you to create these fancy developer portals. You know, the API management has a built-in developer portal, but not everybody is crazy about that setup or the way that works. Sometimes you want something a little more customizable, and now you can kind of create the look and feel that you want in WordPress, and then kind of connect that to your API management surface so that all your APIs can be exposed that way. So that's kind of one update. Another one is also related to APIs. This is the Azure API Center. If you recall, we had the PM on recently talk about it. Essentially, it's a kind of a repository or a way to take an inventory of all your APIs in Azure, right? And it could be non-Azure APIs as well, but it's a center place where everybody can go and say, hey, what APIs do I have have access to as a company? And so developers can discover new APIs that you have, and you can have an inventory for governance, etc., on the list of APIs that you have. A new thing that they're announcing is an extension to the VS Code extension. There is a VS Code extension for API Center. So if you're building an API, you can publish it to the API Center. But now, if you have an API that is not in the it's not in the API Center, you can use an OpenAI plugin to generate the Swagger document, the Swagger file for the which is what is required. And then you can also generate the documentation, the markdown for it. So it kind of uses a little bit of OpenAI magic to create all that for you. And then you can quickly kind of publish that to the API Center and make it available for others to consume. So it takes away a little bit of work that the developers typically had to do to make that happen in the past. And then, yeah, Kendall, this is the one I was talking about with regards to AKS support for our managed Prometheus service. And so, you know, when Prometheus is connected to to our AKS clusters, to be able to configure them to enable monitoring for different workloads. Typically, only somebody who had access to the kubectl, the kube system namespace could do it, right? As someone who just had access to your own namespace in a multi-tenanted system, for example, you couldn't manage the Prometheus monitoring system for your pods in your namespace. Now with this new system, they've kind of released some operators and CRDs in AKS, and so if you have access to a specific namespace, you want to control, you know, what Prometheus is scraping from your namespace, you can do that using these new operators that are available out of the box. So it kind of gives you a little more flexibility for users of Prometheus under AKS.
I like this too, just because I feel like this is the experience people are used to in open source. And so I feel like, it's always hard. This is a space I work in, building managed services that enable people to use open source more easily, but it usually comes with a cost and a sacrifice. And so I feel like that's one of the big reasons why this is really powerful is you get a managed experience, but you get to operate it and work with it like it's the open source version. So I think it's great.
Absolutely correct. Good call out there. And then also in terms of AKS, Kendall, you may recall some of the pain if you want to move from one OS SKU to another, like if you're on Ubuntu Linux and you want to move to an Azure Linux or some other image that's available in AKS, you have to do all the drama with the draining and the cordoning and whatnot of all your nodes and workloads. Now you can do an in-place upgrade, right? So let's say you're using Ubuntu Linux and you want to move to Azure Linux. You kind of do it in place. You don't have to provision all those extra nodes in your environment to make it happen. So this again is.
I was just going to say, I feel like another reason that's pretty compelling is because when you have to think about that from a network perspective, whenever you're having to bring a bunch of new VMs online and all of that. So I feel like this is really big just because it actually also helps and optimizes like the amount of resource allocation in network space that you have to have
Right,
to
right.
operate the cluster.
All the
Yeah.
IPs that you need in your range, you need double the IPs essentially sometimes. Awesome. Yeah, and then there's a couple of more updates that I have. Let me see here. Yep. App configuration. We've talked about app configuration service. It's a nice service in Azure where you can kind of store all your configuration, not just Key Vault. Key Vault had always had the secret configuration, but you may have just general configuration for your app. So app configuration is that service that lets you manage it. And in the past, if you had app service and you wanted to consume all the app configuration, you'd have to write some code in your app to pull it. Now, using the app configuration references pane, which is available on the portal, you can just say, "Hi, all my configurations in this particular app configuration," and go get it. And so that kind of takes away some of the pain that developers had to do in the past. Now, if you have secrets in there that your app configuration is referencing, so it's referencing an underlying key vault, you have to do some extra setup to make sure you have access to that key vault. But generally, the developer doesn't have to do any work. So that's a nice feature here. And then last couple of updates I have, this is regarding Azure Carbon optimization. I think a lot of customers have requirements from their own companies from their organizations to reduce their carbon footprint or keep an eye on it, monitor what it is, see what they can do to optimize it. And so Microsoft has built this into Azure, a completely new portal where you can go and monitor what my carbon footprint is, right? How can I optimize it? Maybe I can run it in certain times of the day, workloads, modify things. So this whole thing has been made available in public preview right now. And finally, I think the coolest feature of all is this new Azure extended zones. So, we've always had Azure availability zones, but now there's an extended zone that's available in Los Angeles itself. And so this is like a mini Azure data center within Los Angeles. That's an extension of one of the US West zones. And this allows for within that area for very low latency workloads. So if there's a workload that has to be served from within Los Angeles, it could use that particular zone. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't have any preview into or any back story as to why this has come about, but it is interesting that the next Olympics is in Los Angeles. So I'm just saying, you never know why they put this out there. But again, that's not the official story. I don't know why they put it in there. Just a happy coincidence. All right. Well, that's all the updates I have. And Audrey, thanks for hanging in there. Can you please, I know you've been on the show before, but why don't you reintroduce yourself to our listeners? Tell us what you're doing these days in Azure, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thank you so much for introducing me back on the podcast. I'm really happy to be here and talk with you folks. So I am a security and identity subject matter expert. I work with Sujit in industry solutions engineering, and I work a lot these days on security with identity with AI projects. That seems to be a lot of the projects that are actually coming into our space these days are AI driven and AI related. So I've really been jumping into this space of, AI security. And just to be fully transparent, it's still like a growing and very nascent field. So this is where I'm at. I'm kind of jumping in like feet first, just like everybody else in the security field, where we're trying to figure out, okay, what exactly is AI in this space, in this context, and how do we secure it? Like, what are some of the best practices that we can really do here? So those are some of the challenges and fun that I've been really getting into. Aside from really doing that with my projects here in ISE, I'm also like on the side building my own AI security tooling to help me fast track threat modeling. So it's been kind of my own fun dabbling with AI and figuring out how to secure AI at the same time.
Yeah, I remember, Audrey, that threat modeling is something that was very near and dear to you, always has been. I think that's where we had you on the show last time. You talked about some of the threat modeling that you can do in Azure, but it looks like now you're seeing more of the focus within AI. I think we've all been using Azure OpenAI recently, but what are some of the high level security concerns with this approach? I mean, obviously there's the traditional security concerns that you have, access are back, etc. But what are some of the new concerns that customers are talking about when it comes to AI in Azure?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few different tracks here. So there's really the folks who are using, the Azure Open AI endpoint and creating RAG patterns. That's something I see a lot. And then there's the folks who actually want to go in and create their own models, like go into Azure ML, create their own models. But both of them actually overlap with the OWASP top 10 for LLMs. I don't know if you guys have seen a lot of that stuff. It's always evolving and changing. Actually, I think it's even changed the OWASP top 10 within the last month that I've been working on it. But a lot of the same threats that are applied for both of these types of projects are applied to both the RAG plus OpenAI endpoint model and like creating your own. I can go through some of those if that's something that's interesting for you.
Yeah, and also just for our listeners, maybe elaborate on what OWASP is. I know we spoke about it a while ago, so maybe just give our listeners a quick refresher on what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who are new to OWASP, it's essentially a standard. It's a standard that folks in research fields from not just Microsoft but all over the world really collaborate on to understand what are some of the biggest threats. One of the most popular guides that you've probably heard is the OWASP Top 10 for application security, which goes over the top 10 threats and mitigations that are commonly seen in web applications. I use this framework pretty frequently, but OWASP has now pivoted to actually figuring out a top 10 for LLM applications. And there is a lot of overlap between the two. And actually, they both should be used with Azure Project, especially because we are still doing those like web applications, and understanding and how to harden that infrastructure is still in play here. But also, if we're building models, like how do we have to figure out like to put some security mitigations into some of those models that we're actually creating. And like I said, it's such a nascent field that it's still changing and evolving every day, which is really great. But some of the things that are different from the OWASP LLM 10 is the fact that we're really focusing here on other like things that can be introduced within the model itself and by interacting with the model, which is a different kind of interface than the web applications. And here you'll see things like prompt injections. Like how do we identify and protect against prompt injections, sensitive information disclosure? That's not a new thing from both of the lists, but also insecure plugin design, output handling, training data poisoning. Like how do we prevent that? Excessive agency, over reliance on LLMs. That's like a really interesting topic actually that we see a lot. Model of denial of service, some of the supply chain vulnerabilities that we see with LLMs, and some model theft. So like I said, that's the 10 for LLMs, which is a little different from the OWASP 10 for applications, but it does have a specific scope here. And I see, there's a hand.
I'm curious, are there currently any tools that helps with monitoring, or how do we identify these vulnerabilities that are happening and how do we address them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll go through a few different methods here with you. And please jump into if there's any questions or anything you want me to drill in deeper on. But first and foremost, this is also a Microsoft principle too, where we should threat model our applications whenever we're creating them for production, both inside and outside of Microsoft with working with customers too. So we have a better understanding of our threat landscape. And I would say that if you don't do threat modeling, I would totally recommend jumping in, figuring it out. I'm also here to help. Like I know in the old podcast, I discussed a little bit about threat modeling, and I do a lot of talks on threat modeling these days too. So happy to help and jump in anywhere needed here. But with a threat model, you actually get the system application that you're planning on creating, and you really dive deep, understanding all of the different flows that are going in and out of that system. You see what services you're touching, and then you get a better understanding of that config. And why that's really important is because as a security engineer, when you're looking at architecture, the first thing that you think about is, okay, how do I break this? Or how can I break into this? Or like, what are some things here that other people are going to figure out how to break into? Or like, what are some of the configurations that we can best use when we're actually like doing some of these threat models? And when we're doing threat modeling, we always try to put the information in the threat model of the current state of the system so we can figure out better ways to mitigate against them. And in Azure land, like that could be like, hey, why aren't we using like managed identities? Like there's a lot of API keys going on around here. Like what does the network security structure look like? What does the data security posture story look like here? But then on top of that, we'll also have the LLM 10 to think about like, okay, now how can prompt injection be used here? What does the user interface look like for our LLM? Are we using a RAG pattern? Like, is there anything we can do to really safeguard against some of those documents that we're putting into those RAG patterns? Or is there anything we can do to like content filter against some of the inputs that we're seeing here in our application?
Audrey, I've heard the name jailbreak being used a lot with LLMs. Is that are you familiar with that? Like, I believe it's a way to kind of force the LLM to do something different from your prompt. Like, I think it's related to prompt engineering, but can you? I feel like that's something that our listeners need to know about.
Yeah, absolutely. So jailbreaking is one of those techniques where folks try to work around the prompt content filters and whatnot that we put in place to still kind of get the answers in the data that, malicious adversaries are looking for. And I'll give you the very simple example that you'll probably hear on a lot of like talks around like jailbreaking LLMs. I know Mark Brasinovich has some great ones from Build if you guys are interested in digging deeper into this subject. But essentially, since AI is so nascent and it's really like black box testing at this point, where you don't really understand how the LLM is actually creating a response. And because of that, what we try to do in Microsoft and in Azure specifically is try to put content filters in front of the inputs and the outputs to try to ensure that we are triggering on like, hey, this content is harmful or this is not content that we want to give back to the user. However, when we think about securing LLMs in this sense, we think of a Swiss cheese model because we can put content filters in front of it, but jailbreaking can actually figure out a way to manipulate that input to actually get what we want. And a great example of jailbreaking is basically manipulating our prompts to get the answer we want. And bombs are a great example. Like, I do not endorse people going on and trying to figure out how to make bombs. However, if you go to an LLM and you say, like, how do I make a bomb? Sometimes it'll tell you how to make a bomb. But if we put content filtering in front of it, it'll say, like, oh, this is like actually like harmful content. I don't want to provide you with that answer. However, with jailbreaking, then we could manipulate that input to say, oh, but it's for academic research. And now these days, actually, the content filters do a good job of like saying, oh, even though it's for academic research, it's still creating a bomb. However, now with jailbreaking, some new techniques have come in where folks can actually say, like, how do I make a bomb? But instead of like having the word bomb, it's like in ASCII art. And then that takes the LLM more tokens and more context to actually understand what you're asking. And then sometimes it'll drop the content filter context and still provide you with like, okay, here's how you make a bomb. So that's a really simple, plain example of jailbreaking. And that is probably one of the most common threats right now into our LLM systems today is figuring out different ways to get data by manipulating and tricking and giving the LLM additional inputs or rewards, which is also really interesting because if you give your prompt a reward, like, hey, if you actually do this, I'll give you like $10,000. A lot of the times the LLM obliges and they're like, oh, heck yeah, I want $10,000. So it will actually give you the answer. But yeah, these days, this is something that security researchers, both in Microsoft, outside of Microsoft, are all trying to figure out, like, what is the best kind of content filtering or other methods that we can actually do for these LLMs to not provide back an answer or like prevent some jailbreaking. And also going back to the tools question, there are tools in Azure. Like, for example, there is content filtering that we can put in to like try to not have harmful inputs and outputs of the LLM. And there are prompt shields, which is another new feature over in Azure Open AI to also like try to prevent some of that jailbreaking. And there's specific content filters for jailbreaks. And as I alluded to before, even though they're much better now, they're still with a lot of adversarial engineering, there's still ways you can break them. And we're just hoping as time progresses in the future, we'll have better technologies to really safeguard against hopefully all of that. But for now, that's kind of the way it is. Just think of your LLM as a junior engineer. I love hearing that because do you trust your junior engineer to diagnose someone with medical advice? Like that's something that folks should really be thinking of when they're actually creating some of these systems for users.
Okay, this is all really interesting. I'm not going to lie, because I really haven't thought a lot about, because to me, there's like two elements. One is like primarily right now, I'm more of like an end user of various language models than I am on any sort of like working on the implementation side of the house of like actually generating, building, integrating into applications, that kind of stuff. So like the way I think about it is very much from like a traditional development perspective, where you sort of have the like, oh, like I'm looking at this OWASP top 10 sort of like PDF just based on what you were sending. And there's example attack scenarios for each of these vectors, which I find very interesting because it helps you conceptualize and make real what some of these different, attack vectors are. And like, for example, I can totally understand the concept of like, oh, your LLM or, the Open AI depends on a Python library, and that has the ability to be taken advantage of and potentially manipulated in order to create a backdoor into like the language model itself. Like that's kind of one element, which is like the actual creation deployment type of security, which to me feels a little bit more traditional from a developer perspective. And then there's sort of the psychological element of like the end user being able to manipulate, inject, which is what we were just talking about. So I'm curious, I understand people who are building their own language learning models, those are packaged and can be deployed, I guess, as containers, right? You can run a machine learning LLM models as, I guess, they have to be packaged and deployed in some way. And I know people run these on Kubernetes. So do you have tools is traditional development tools like Sneak and is that used to identify vulnerable dependencies, or do you have to have some other tooling which can identify these like downstream or upstream dependencies that might actually impact the language model as it's being produced versus more of like the consumption and training? And like the second part of that, so like are traditional development tools being used from a like LLM generation and testing perspective? And then like on the other side of the house, is it mostly automated tests that are catching these various jailbreak scenarios? Like, are you just having to brute force test it and like put in a bunch of input and then essentially generate output reports that help you understand if the model responded as you'd expect when tempted by these various like threat models you've created in scenarios? So that would be the two parts, one kind of more in the development stage, one and more of the output testing, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are some great questions too. So I'm actually going to take one step into a different direction that's going to answer both your questions. So there is a methodology used at Microsoft called red teaming. And, I don't want to confuse my security folks, because red teaming actually has a totally different meaning in the security world, where it's more about like penetrating like web applications and whatnot to try to find like openings to get into your system. So red teaming at Microsoft is actually a little bit different. For AI, I should say, red teaming for AI, it's a little bit different. Where what folks do is they get around like the project that they're building, perhaps like some of the LLMs that they're creating, and they actively try to break them. So that's something called like identifying harms. And when we identify some of the harms, then we try to put in some prevention mechanisms. And it is very manual at this moment. Like if you actually go to the Microsoft red teaming pages, there are tools there. Like there's a tool called Pirate that is also there to help you identify some of those, threats and whatnot with the LLM that you're building. But aside from using that type of a tool, there's also this red teaming exercise where you get together with your dev team or your team and you try to figure out some ways to actually like break into your LLM. And that actually does a few really interesting things here. It gives you context on like what are some of the, it's like a big bug bash, right? Like it's like gives you context on like what are some of the answers that I'm getting from my LLM that potentially are not being caught by content filters, not being caught by prompt shields, and that could potentially like be a bad response to a customer, for example. So I would absolutely recommend you and your team go and do some of these red teaming exercises, because the output of that is understanding, okay, what prompts did we actually put in? Like, for example, like to an LLM that could give me back data customer data, maybe like data I don't want other people to see. And then that could require a few different scenarios here. Re-architecting is always something, especially when we're getting near production, that's something that people don't want to do. But depending on the severity of what it is that the LLM is responding with, like that potentially could be a solution here, which that sucks. But also like in the easier side is that we figure out some good tests that we can actually create to put into our LLMs to see if like some of those test results that we get back are still like coming back with that answer that we didn't want, because that's also like, content filters that we can add ourselves as well to safeguard against some of those malicious prompts coming back out. And this is definitely a way where you can go in and figure out like ways to also like safeguard against like those LLMs that you're creating. Because when you are creating an LLM, you're also enriching it with data, right? So that's also like something that you can get as a takeaway from that data set that potentially you're enriching it with I'm not going to tell you this is an easy feat by any means, but you could figure out like which like data set that you're ingesting into your LLM potentially has like content that you don't like, that you think it's like actually harmful. So then you can go back and reintroduce training data to your LLM.
Angela, as a follow-up, go ahead and ask your question. Okay. Well, I was going to ask about, I'm just going to mention about the process of evaluation that we do, right? And sure, Audrey, you hear this a lot in LLMs. And, evaluation is something that we've been pushing a lot with our customers. Their customers, like, everybody wants to jump onto the AI bandwagon. And we're like, okay, have you evaluated the kind of use cases that you have? And, do you have a good ground truth data set? Have you captured, what the correct responses should be? And then, of course, are you running that on a regular basis, right? And of course, there's all sorts of, I think Azure Open AI Studio, I think, has ways where you can kind of automate some of these things. But that's, in that ground truth data set, we put a lot of what we call diversity questions, right? So these are questions that are not really related to the use case, and they could be random questions like, hey, create this bullet point, or or generate a document for me with just like an open-ended question. They want to see how the LLM responds in those scenarios and not revealing something inadvertently. So certainly that is something I feel our customers need to look into, is to creating these evaluation systems and then running them more regularly, maybe weekly or whatever cadence is appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. And on top of that too, we do have like AI assessments like at the very beginning of the process too. I wanted to quickly call that out as well, like the Microsoft Responsible AI Impact Assessment. Folks should absolutely be filling that out as well, like at the beginning of their projects, so they can really understand and identify some of those harms and some potential issues that they're going to have along the way too. So great call out.
Okay, I have 2 more questions. I honestly have a million questions, and half of them probably don't make any sense because I'm just like now I'm just very curious. So one is, what are there tools, like obviously you can create, like when you're running an application, you can see how people are interacting with it. There's a lot of different tools out there for monitoring, observability. Are there tools out there that exist specifically to help visualize all of the various types of questions and everything that's being sent? Like I imagine OpenAI daily is getting, a million questions, and obviously the relevance to what people are using it for is so critical. So like, are there new tools that are used to do that, or do people who are writing these like really large like OpenAI models, are they creating their own visualization layer to aggregate the incoming user interaction data so that they can see how people are using it? Curious on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me go through some of the new tools that I got, like actually a new list like just before I jumped on here, so I could happily share that with you guys. First and foremost, there's prompt shields. That's a little bit of an older tool. I'm going to say older because it's really not that old, but it's there to help detect and block like prompt injection attacks. And that includes like new models for identifying also like indirect prompt injections before they actually go and impact your model. And they actually have new features that are actually coming soon as well for the Azure AI content safety space. So that's one of the new tools that's an existing tool, which is going to have new features coming forward. There's also 2 tools that are coming, actually 3 tools that are coming soon and or in preview. There's something called the groundedness detection tool to detect some hallucinations in model outputs, the safety system messages to steer model behaviors towards like safe, responsible outputs, and something called a safety evaluation. Now, I believe this one is in preview, and this is to assess the application's vulnerabilities from like jailbreaking attacks and generating content risks. For monitoring right now, there is something called the risk and safety monitoring service that is there to understand what the model inputs and outputs and users are triggering those content filters to inform some mitigations. That's available, but I think that might be in preview. So I apologize for that. I don't actually know that one off the top of my head. But also there is another tool that's coming out from the Defender for Cloud series. This one also is in preview. As you can see, it's a nascent field. We're moving very quickly here, but it's basically threat protection for Gen AI apps, which is really cool, right? So it actually sits in front of the AI safety, what's it called? The AI, I just said it, AI content safety feature. And what that's going to do is help do some threat protection for your Gen AI apps. So those are some of the things that we have right now in Azure as far as tooling. But other than that, there's that Pirate tool that I mentioned earlier to help you do some of that red teaming. But as for all I know, those are the only things that I know that we could use to actually help us.
Audrey, I'm curious, for some of the tools you were mentioning, does it get smarter as more people use it? And does it almost like customize to a specific user or specific application, given that these are the type of inputs they usually get, and these are the type of outputs that they get from the AI model? That's my first question. And some questions about access control. So is there a way that I can set it so that if I have more privileges, I can get access to more information that are, for instance, like customer data that you said were confidential, versus if someone else logs in and they don't have as much privileges as I do, then they only see the redacted data or the, I don't know, more vanilla version of the model outputs.
Yeah, both are great questions. So I'm actually going to jump into the second one first, if that's okay, because that one's very interesting. So this one in regards to like access controls. So this is a really tricky question because it really depends on how you set up your model and what you want it to access. Because I would say access controls to the model itself, like from like an Azure perspective, like we're pretty good at that by now, right? Like we can determine like who has access to what models or who has access to what Azure Open AI endpoints, and then they can kind of go from there. But in regards to access from a different data source, for example, like if we use the RAG pattern, for example, so with a RAG pattern, we already have our AI deployed, and then we introduce like documents to enrich the experience so that AI pattern or that AI LLM, will actually be enriched with some documents, maybe specific to your user, and then it could provide an answer. So that type of access control is a little tricky because as we can imagine with AI, if we give AI certain access to data, then that actually opens up a whole different can of worms. And why I want to say it like that is because with an AI, we still have like some of those problems with hallucination, with potentially like misunderstanding like exactly what the answer it is that it's trying to achieve. But it also does it well enough to actually like figure out like, okay, you are this user, you're logged in, you only have access to potentially like this data set. So let's go and find the database that you have access to, and then we can find those documents and enrich that LLM. Like that's some programming that everyone does today, and I feel pretty confident about that as like a user, like figuring out your permissioning and your auth and giving the LLM potentially enriched data. However, I would not allow your LLM to do that. You know what I mean? Because like that would be really, really a bad move on your part to give an LLM like, okay, by the way, you figure out what this person's access is and you figure out what documents to ingest to give them the best answer, because that is really unpredictable. And I would say that if you are using a pattern that does something like that, to really reevaluate that and go do some red teaming. Like definitely go try to understand, like if you allow the LLM to define the access control policies, then you'll find that I'm sure you'll have a really hard time securing a system like that.
No, that's a really good point. I think it's very important to give the LLM the least amount of information it needs to answer the question. That's always been our drive with customers. So, customer has 1 million records. We're going to pull specific records and only specific fields in those records that are required to answer the question, and then give the LLM that information. Then let the LLM go to town on because it has a limited set of information. That's all it can do is provide the answer from there.
I totally understand what Cynthia's saying though, because I imagine there's a pattern, right? Like I'm just thinking about this. Like let's say in the future someone wants to monetize a model, and in that model, if you're level 0 tier, let's say you pay $5 a month, like you only get access to answers with a certain amount of specificity, or there's only a certain amount of like, I don't know, let's say it's a food scanning app and it's like, oh, you can only scan, a certain subset of foods, but then other foods that are over a certain price threshold or something, we don't actually provide results for. But maybe if somebody's paying $20, the same model would be trained on more data and unleash more content. So I'm curious, there has to be a way to do that, whether it's maybe taking the same model, duplicating it, and basically saying per tier, you get a different model that you're working with that's exposed. But I totally understand conceptually that concept. But yeah, it sounds like what you wouldn't want to do is basically say, oh, it knows everything, but it has to be mindful of not using what it's learned about these things when the person is asking this question, because I'm assuming, once they know it. So it's still going to have some level of influence over responses, and there might be like it would open up. It's like multi-tenancy in a database, but not actually enforcing the multi-tenancy, and instead expecting it to be like, hey, by the way, you're multi-tenant, don't talk about this with this person. I'm sure that's a little bit harder to do. But I totally get where your brain was going, because same. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I was just gonna say, I do have a question for you. Is there ever the model or the concept of like, I'm gonna take another AI model, I'm gonna take another LLM, and I'm gonna train it on literally the worst, like poisoned data, the worst things coming in, the things that like my model has struggled with in the past, or that are the biggest risks, and it's basically like almost a poison model, and you're running that AI model to interact with your LLM to determine, like, because to me, I would want to take everything that my red team basically did and like codify it into another model that could then run, and you're basically trying to poison the model in an automated way based on what it struggled with before. Does that make sense? Does that happen?
So I have not heard of that use case. What I've heard though is typically like after red teaming exercises get done, folks will actually create like user story or user tests like for that, so that whenever you're going through and doing all of your testing, some of those tests will still get triggered. But I would not be surprised actually if that someone did want to create another model that had a bunch of malicious input or things that actually broke your model, and you allowed that to also like, I'm gonna like loosely say like red team, like have like a red teaming model to red team your production model or your dev test model. And the reason why I think that I don't see that a lot is because models are expensive. So folks probably don't want to actually do that.
Yeah, I was gonna clarify that a little bit, that we're using the word LLMs a lot. Obviously LLMs are the ones that are being put out by the large companies like OpenAI, Microsoft, Amazon, etc. And they take months to train, right? An LLM takes typically 100 days or more running nonstop on 25,000 computers to train. It typically costs many millions of dollars to train in compute costs. So that doesn't happen very frequently. But what you are referring to, Kendall, are SLMs, which are small language models, which are becoming very popular these days. And those you can containerize and run in Kubernetes. And so there's a lot of that going on there. And there's like a gazillion models you can pull up from Hugging Face, which are all small language models. And I'm sure that's where, I'm sure, Audrey, you've seen that, where you have to be careful what you're getting there, because you don't know what the model is trained on, right? You can't just pluck any model over there and just pick it, it looks good. You have to run through all these tests, battery of tests, to make sure it's not going to do something you don't want done.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, you'd never know what those Hugging Face models are being trained on. So I would be very cautious about plucking one of those and putting it into production.
Fair enough.
Great.
Audrey, I'm so curious on my first question of like, do the tools or like prompt shields and content filtering get better?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. They get better. And, Azure, especially like with those services in AI right now, they look at your feedback and they take it very seriously. So like personally, I always put bugs in whenever I find them in Azure Open AI, and I always get like responses like really quickly, which is like awesome. So they're there to make those better. Everyone's like all on board in AI, especially in Microsoft. So we want to make it better. We want your feedback. And if folks out there actually find something that is interesting that potentially breaks a content filter, file it as a bug. That's the best thing that you could do for both the community and your project.
Are they trained though? Like, do they actually learn from the user data, and like, are they AI? Like, like I know what Cynthia's saying. If a product that we,
if I am a consumer products producer, does it get more specialized in like consumer oh my god, CPG products related content? Because my content filter may be the same what Kendall is using in the beginning, but as I continue to use it, like I want it more related to food, and I want it to be like an expert in food. And if it asks about like, I don't know, cups or bowls, I don't care as much.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you can create your own content filters too, is that if that's what you're alluding to? Because yeah, absolutely you can. And a lot of folks even create content filters and like put them on like Azure samples, for example. So you could actually go and learn from what content filters that like people have also been creating that potentially could help you or that you could provide back to the community.
Yeah, and I think that one of the biggest ways to get better is by your history, right? So the history of your queries and responses is what makes an LLM better. It only knows what you have, how you have communicated with it, and so if you can pass that history on or make it available to the LLM on subsequent calls, obviously there's a limit, right? We all know that all LLMs eventually have a token limit. So it can be an infinite, but that's what makes it better, right? It's going to know, okay, you started asking me a lot about food, and so okay, it's going to kind of gravitate towards food or whatever it may be, and not answer non-food related responses. Well,
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
has been awesome, Audrey. You really sparked so much of discussion. I feel like we could go on for a little bit over here. It looks like Kendall still has another 500,000 questions in her mind, but we'll have to get to that another time. Thanks so much for coming on the show, and Cynthia and Kendall, really great to hear all the insightful questions that you had for Audrey. It really got me thinking on a lot of topics that are near and dear to our customers. We're all working with customers in some way, and I think this is something they all need to keep mindful of, and hopefully our listeners will pick up on that as well. And if you have any links, I know you talked about the OWASP links and any other of your thing. I know Audrey's appeared on a number of conferences herself. I think you were at DEF CON, is it? What were you last week? I forget.
Yeah, I wasn't speaking at DEF CON. I was just an attendee for that
right.
one.
But
I will be.
You've been speaking at a number of these shows. I keep seeing it on LinkedIn and whatnot. That you're always in some conference or the other.
Absolutely. And I'm always talking about threat modeling. And right now my talks are really focused around like how I'm building AI tooling to help me with threat modeling. So, there's so many different ways of like doing threat modeling, both as like a security engineer and then as a developer, like how can I help accelerate myself?
So if you have any any of those resources you want to share as well, please send them over and we'll add them to the show notes. All right.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, thanks again for coming on.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate being on this podcast.